Well, I was born in a very small town in what was then called the Old Western Transvaal. Now it's called the Northwest Province, with the name of Zeerust. And some of my early memories of Zeerust is being a very, very racist community, especially the white community, extremely racist and right-wing. I was telling a friend of mine a few nights ago, and I could see he couldn't even believe it, that at night at 9 o'clock there was a siren going off in the town, and that meant that there was a curfew, that at 9 o'clock in the evening, all black people had to leave the town. If there was a black person found in the town, they would be arrested and thrown into jail. So that is the background where I come from. I grew up in the White Dutch Reformed Church, which believed in the theology of apartheid. That theology actually says that they see themselves similar to the Israelites, to the Jews, as the chosen people. And therefore, that they are chosen above the black people, and they consider the black people to what the Bible describes as the hewers of wood and the carriers of water, therefore the workers and the slaves who must work and slave for the white people. So this is the kind of society that I grew up in. And I went to the primary school there, Laerskool Zeerust. My father was a very right-wing man. He worked on the South African railways. He was a fitter and turner. So I come from working-class Afrikaner stock. Another interesting thing about that little town, Zeerust, is, although I didn't know it at the time, I was, of course, still a very, very young boy, but President Jacob Zuma and the team of people, the comrades with him, who were leaving the country to go and join Umkhonto we Sizwe and to get trained as soldiers of the Liberation Army, were actually arrested at Zeerust. President Zuma and I joked the other day that we've got that link in our past of him having been arrested in Zeerust and me having been born there. But anyhow, I came to Johannesburg at the age of 13 when my dad was transferred to work on the railways at Braamfontein. And I grew up from then on in Johannesburg. I went to an Afrikaans high school in the area of Witpoortjie in Krugersdorp. The high school's name was Hoërskool Die Adelaar. Again, a very conservative Afrikaans community. But at 16, I became part of what we called in the Dutch Reformed Church a mission group. Youngsters who went out to do mission work, and amongst the areas that we went to was Soweto. And I think it's significant that for the first time in my life, and that indicates the kind of divisions that we had under apartheid in South Africa, that for the first time in my life, only at the age of 16, did I for the first time enter an African township. And the experience there really had shaken me up, because I made a comparison between the very comfortable living conditions that I had, even as a lower middle class, working class white person in South Africa, compared to the conditions that I saw in the township, and especially in the mining hostels, because we visited the mining hostels. And I've got a memory that had stuck in my brain, in fact, it's burned into my brain, of going into one of those hostels, the dinginess, the darkness, the poverty. And as we were standing there, there was an elderly gentleman. He could have been my father, he could even have been my grandfather, who was sitting on a tin. And he saw this young white boy who I was, a young boy of 16 years old, and he jumped up and he presented this tin to me to sit on. And I thought, but how can this be possible? This is an elderly gentleman who now treats me as a young white, in Afrikaans we say snuiter, snotneus, with such respect just because I'm white. And those experiences really rattled me. So I started asking questions about apartheid. I started asking questions about why there's this huge difference between the living conditions of white people and the living conditions of the majority of black, especially African people. And in 1976, which was the year that I was in Standard 9 at school, the Soweto uprisings came. And because of those experiences that I had from seeing what was the living conditions in Soweto, I asked at my school whether the young students who were rising up against apartheid and against the use of Afrikaans as a language of instruction were not right. It caused an outrage in my school. My teachers were extremely angry. In fact, the headmaster called my mum and dad in, and they even threatened to expel me from the school. My parents had to plead for them to allow me to finish my Standard 9 and my matric grade 12 year in that school. So I finished my schooling. I then went to the Rand Afrikaans University, which is today known as the Johannesburg University. Then it was a very Afrikaans and white university. In fact, black students were not allowed to enter that university. And while I was there, I started protesting against the segregation of education. And I also tried to participate in the Student Representative Council. I tried to stand on a ticket that apartheid is wrong and that the university should be open to every South African. I always put up posters at the university in the common areas calling for integrated education and for the release of President Nelson Mandela. And because I put up those posters and because I called for the release of Nelson Mandela, I was charged by the university, brought in front of the university administration, in front of the Senate, and I was expelled from the university. So at a very young age, at the age of 19 years old, I was expelled from the Rand Afrikaans University. My dad was extremely angry. He had to pay for my university education. He got some bursaries from the Afrikaans Language and Culture Society to cover my studies. And when I was expelled from the university, those bursaries had to be paid back. So in his anger, he chased me out of the house. And I ended up literally on street for a couple of weeks. I didn't have anywhere to stay. I was sleeping on park benches. I was basically just hanging around. And then I saw a poster in one of the parks on one of the lampposts, which said that the then Dean of the Anglican Church in Johannesburg, Father Simeon Nkwane, was fasting and praying because people were being thrown out of informal settlements, losing the only roof that they had over their heads. And I thought, let me go and try and meet this priest, because it seems to me that he may be able to understand what I'm concerned about. So I managed to get to St. Mary's Cathedral in the center of Johannesburg. The secretary of Father Simeon Nkwane was very surprised to see this young white Afrikaner boy arriving there saying that I want to see Father Nkwane. Eventually she allowed me to meet with him. When he met me and he listened to my story, he said to me, "Young man, I think you must come back tomorrow. I want to introduce you to someone who may understand where you come from and your experience is better." So I went back the next day. And when I walked in, I was shocked, I was surprised, because there was another white man sitting with him. And this white man just looked like one of my uncles, an oom. He was dressed in a safari suit. He had, those short safari suit trousers on with the long socks, with a comb in the sock. I thought, hey, this man is called the security police to come and arrest me. But it turned out that it was actually Dr. Beyers Naudé, one of the greatest fighters against apartheid, someone who himself came from the Afrikaner community, who was a priest in the Dutch Reformed Church, who realized that apartheid was wrong and stood up against apartheid. So Mbeki, as we all called him, became my mentor. He became like my father. I always say that my father could no longer be my father because he couldn't understand what was happening in my mind. Mbeki became to me the dad that my own father could not be. So Mbeki helped me to interpret the South African society. He introduced me to many of the black liberation leaders in South Africa, people inside the country. He also introduced me to the history of the African National Congress. He gave me some of the writings of Chief Albert Luthuli and Comrade Oliver Tambo. He also allowed me in his house to listen on Radio Freedom to the speeches of Comrade Oliver Tambo. And that had a huge impact on me. So over a period of time, I decided, look, the only way that I can fight apartheid is to be able to join the African National Congress. But then I was challenged with another critical question. The ANC has an armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe. The ANC is involved in a military armed struggle against the apartheid regime. Am I prepared to get involved in violence, in an armed struggle against the apartheid regime, against people in the Afrikaans community, even possibly against members of my own family? And I carefully considered this. I carefully studied what was going on in this country, and I could see that the apartheid regime was viciously repressive. I could see that there was no opportunity for freedom of speech, for peaceful protest. Whenever there was an attempt at peaceful protest, it was violently repressed. People were arrested, people were killed, people were thrown into detention for very, very long periods of solitary confinement. All of those things were happening. All of those readings and my discussions with Mbeki, my discussions with fellow leaders in the liberation struggle, black leaders in South Africa, especially in the township of Alexandra, where I had a lot of contact, brought me to the point where I decided that I have to join the ANC, and not only the ANC, but also Umkhonto we Sizwe. Umkhonto we Sizwe was formed on the 16th of December 1961. It was not just formed by the ANC. It was formed by what was then known as the Alliance, the Liberation Alliance, which included the South African Communist Party, the ANC, and also a grouping which were only whites, known as the Congress of Democrats, and also the South African Indian Congress, which consisted mainly of the Transvaal Indian Congress and the Natal Indian Congress, and the South African trade union movement of that time. Moses Kotane was definitely part of that because he was the leader of the South African Communist Party, and he was also part of the trade union movement. So all of them said, here we need to now move a different step. It wasn't easy for them to get to that point because there were leaders in the ANC who didn't want to take that next step, who wanted to simply just continue with peaceful resistance, the old Defiance campaign resistance of the 1950s. But through internal discussion and argument, they convinced those leaders, including also Chief Albert Luthuli, that no, we must create an armed wing, which was now also in a military way resist the apartheid regime. But it wasn't simply the armed wing of the ANC. It was the armed forces of all these combined liberation alliance groupings. That's why when you find the early statements of Umkhonto we Sizwe, it doesn't say we are talking simply on behalf of the ANC. It says we are Umkhonto we Sizwe, we're part of the Liberation Alliance. And that's why Umkhonto we Sizwe was not managed by the National Executive Committee of the ANC, but it had its own high command, of which, of course, there were members of the National Executive Committee of the ANC, of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party, of the trade union movement. That whole alliance grouping were part of the high command of Umkhonto we Sizwe. And their headquarters was at Rivonia, at Lily Leaf's farm. That's where they gathered, where they worked from, and where they were giving the first instructions for the first military actions that were carried out against the apartheid regime on the 16th of December 1961. And where they issued also that famous pamphlet that was distributed throughout the country when the first bombs went off. And remember, the first bombs was attacking infrastructure. It was attacking bridges, it was attacking electricity pylons. There are pictures, you can go and Google them, of the first bombs of Umkhonto we Sizwe that toppled some of the electricity pylons here between Johannesburg and Durban, which cut the electricity supply, and also from the then old Eastern Transvaal, which is now known as Mpumalanga, and those important power stations that were feeding electricity to the big metropole of Johannesburg. So those were the first actions carried out, and that pamphlet says, we are the high command of Umkhonto we Sizwe. We speak on behalf of the people of this country, who says there comes a time in the history of the nation where you either subjugate yourself or you rise up and fight. Now, later on, as the ANC was unbanned, remember, most of the leaders of the high command of Umkhonto we Sizwe were arrested at Rivonia and other parts of South Africa, and then put together in the Rivonia trial, and they were all receiving a life sentence. So in a sense, the top leadership of Umkhonto we Sizwe was removed, and they were taken to prison. Then when the ANC went into exile, Umkhonto we Sizwe increasingly became part of the ANC's infrastructure and the operations of the ANC in exile. And that's how it became known that Umkhonto we Sizwe is the armed wing of the ANC. It didn't start out exclusively as the armed wing just of the ANC. It was of the Broad Liberation Alliance. But because of the logistics and the managerial demands that we had in exile, it became increasingly under the command of the African National Congress and the NEC of the ANC, which they recognize as the political mother body. But Umkhonto we Sizwe always continued to have its own command, its own leadership, its own commanders. So yes, Joe Slobo was a commander of Umkhonto we Sizwe. He was also a senior member of the South African Communist Party. He was also a member of the National Executive of the ANC. Joe Modise, who was the commander of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the most senior commander of Umkhonto we Sizwe, was also a member of the ANC, a member of the National Executive Committee of the ANC, and the same, as I've indicated to you earlier, was true of Chris Hani. Chris was a member of the SACP. He was the chief of staff of Umkhonto we Sizwe, but he was also a member of the National Executive and the National Working Committee of the African National Congress. So the overlap has always been there. And it has, and I think generally in the general public's mind, it's not wrong to describe Umkhonto we Sizwe as the armed wing of the ANC. But the historical development of Umkhonto we Sizwe was a little bit not just exclusively as part of the ANC, it was part of the Broad Liberation Alliance.